Roll 14, slate 1. Okay.
What is it that actually does the damage with a bomb? Can we come in this?
Well, it's one of several things. Probably the most devastating thing is the blast. The blast from a bomb kills most of the victims. Of course, there's shrapnel too, and there's other effects, but it's a blast. And when you have a B-52 strike, you have anything from 50 to 100 bombs. That is normal bombs, but you can imagine the tremendous blast that is created by 50 to 100 bombs dropping within the space of 3 or 4 or 5 seconds over a very limited area. It's just devastating. It's just rolling thunder, somebody calls it. The common name the Americans called it was arc light. We'll arc light them, and certainly it was the effect of an arc light.
What did it do to the body physically?
Of course, it just ruptured everything inside. The successive shock waves going through a body so that everything was ruptured. Blood came from every orifice, and you were dead. Simple as that.
How big were the craters that they generally create?
Well, the craters, depending on the terrain, if it was soft earth, any one of the bombs would leave a crater maybe 5 or 6 feet deep by 12 to 15 feet across. But the point was, there were dozens of them, so that when you walked across afterwards, it was like walking across a giant's face which was pockmarked all over, just a few feet between each crater.
Was that enough to bury a car?
You could bury a normal-sized car in most of the craters.
Can you tell me how napalm works?
I think the easiest way to describe napalm is that it's jellied petroleum, fiery jellied petroleum. It throws out this stuff which can stick to your skin and burn straight through to the bone. It's excruciatingly painful, just tremendously painful, and almost always fatal. Of course, at the same time, the napalm eats up the oxygen completely. So if they're dropped on top of bunkers, which may be very well protected from the initial blast and the jellied petroleum that is thrown out, they got no air because the napalm keeps burning for quite some time and it's using up the oxygen. So those in the bunkers may not have been killed in the initial blast, but die from suffocation.
Does it stick to the skin?
Oh yes, it sticks to the skin and burns right through, burns the flesh right away. Perhaps the most devastating thing I saw was more expressive than anything else. After one particular bombing by napalm, American advisors went into an area with South Vietnamese troops. And there'd been a lot of survivors, of course, and a little old peasant woman came up. She had in her arms, I thought it was a baby for a start. She walked right up to the American officer, didn't say anything, but there was deep hatred in her eye, and she threw the bundle at his feet. And it was a little dog, which turned out to be the only family she'd had left, and the bomb had just burnt him to death. She threw the body of the dog at the American officer's feet.
So it just sticks?
Yes, it sticks to the skin. It's almost always fatal. Horrifying burns, anyway.
Can you tell me about the continuation of with the Viet Cong, and after you talked to the double agent, what happened there? Just where did those people go behind you? Excuse me?
Well, the double agent gave me directions. So I left Highway 4, which was a very busy highway south of Saigon. It was like Piccadilly Circus. I just walked across from Highway 4, less than a mile, into a wooded area, forest, you'd call it. I was greeted by an old man who just said, "Welcome to the liberated area," and there I was. There was a Viet Cong flag flying over a small village, a little hamlet, and they took me in to other villages in deeper.
It's as simple as that, just walking off a highway which was controlled by the South Vietnamese, supposedly?
It was as simple as that. It wasn't so simple to come back later, after I'd spent my time with the Viet Cong.
Okay.
I think it's take 4, isn't it? Take 3 or 4.
Why did the journalists flock to Khe Sanh?
Well, the battle for Khe Sanh became symbolic. There were about 20,000 American Marines encircled by the North Vietnamese. North Vietnamese had very big artillery and very effective artillery in the hills around Khe Sanh, and they wanted to inflict this symbolic defeat on the Americans, and the Americans, for their part, wanted to defend it, wanted to not for Khe Sanh to fall in the same way that Dien Bien Phu fell to the North Vietnamese in the first Indochina War. Very quickly there was only one way to get in, and that was by aircraft. Of course, the North Vietnamese artillery had the airstrip targeted, so as soon as a plane put down, there was a barrage of mortars and artillery fell onto the airstrip. The planes never stopped taxiing. You had to jump out of them as they were taxiing, jump onto them when you wanted to get out again. In the same way, helicopters were shot down as well as planes over Khe Sanh. The North Vietnamese had anti-aircraft batteries as well as the artillery in the hills around Khe Sanh. There was tremendous bombardment of the American base there. They concentrated on the Americans to demoralize them. And they did to a great extent, although the Americans held on. But what almost every journalist who visited there omitted to mention was that the outer perimeter of most of Khe Sanh was defended by South Vietnamese troops, South Vietnamese Rangers. In fact, most of them were. So that for the North Vietnamese to physically overrun Khe Sanh, they would have had to overrun the South Vietnamese troops first. And they were the ones who were taking the brunt of the ground attacks. And there were many ground attacks on Khe Sanh. But few Americans actually faced the North Vietnamese face-to-face across the wire. It was the South Vietnamese who took that. And that's a thing that's almost forgotten in the history of Khe Sanh. When people recount the battle for Khe Sanh, eventually the Americans were able to relieve it. Just about everybody forgets that very courageous South Vietnamese troops were always encircling and protecting the some very courageous South Vietnamese troops were protecting the Americans inside from direct ground attack.
What would have happened if the South Vietnamese had been overrun by the North Vietnamese? Could they withdraw?
Theoretically, the South Vietnamese were able to withdraw into the American part of Khe Sanh, but in fact it's very likely they wouldn't have been able to, because the Americans controlled their inner perimeter and there are only certain ways through it. If the South Vietnamese had have been in the process of being overrun, it's my opinion the Americans would have closed off the escape route for the South Vietnamese into their own compound in order to save themselves. That may have been valid militarily.
How did the Americans finally get out of Khe Sanh?
The American Marines in Khe Sanh were eventually relieved by an American Airborne Division, who road convoy, supported and protected by very heavy airstrikes and armed helicopters flying overhead. Of course, there's no love lost between the American Marines and the American Airborne. Marines like to do everything themselves and fight their own way out of difficult situations. And indeed, they were so jealous of the fact that they were being relieved by the Airborne. The Airborne had to come to their rescue, in other words, that they fired on a number of helicopters, their own helicopters, American helicopters. Some were hit, there were some casualties. Several came down.
Can you tell me about the North Vietnamese being heard by the South Vietnamese tunnelling?
Right, why don't we just stop?
Okay.
Take 5. Well, the United States might have been pulling out of South Vietnam in 1970, but with President Nixon's Cambodian incursion in the same year, the war was only just beginning there in Cambodia.
The war was only just beginning.
Well, I mean...